Hey, what's going on, class? Hope you have made the transition or are in process of making the transition to online education the best you can. I know I put in a lot of links and stuff this week just to kind of get us back into the swing, but I also wanted to take a little time. I'm going to be doing these like no more than 10-minute long lectures. Well, I'm calling them lectures, but they're really not going to be lectures. They're really just going to be giving you a little more context or a little bit of specificity or a deeper dive on some of the context and some of the information that you've been reading about in your readings. And so this week, I wanted to go into a little bit about the Russian theater, but specifically the Moscow Art Theater and the personalities and the people surrounding that, because the dominant training techniques that came out in the 20th century, whether it's Stella Adler or Lee Strasberg or Sanford Meisner or Stanislavski or Michael Chekhov or any of these other people, they're all rooted initially in Stanislavski. But a lot of this stuff can become very dry or very esoteric if you're reading about it and you don't really have a context with which to move forward or to base any of your understanding in. So rather than give you a long lecture on what Stanislavskian technique is, or the differences between Meyerhold and Stanislavski and those things, I'm going to talk a little bit about those, but I wanted to give you a little bit more of the resources that you can go to, especially right now. Some of these things I think will be online, or a lot of libraries have digitized books that you can approach, or even if you can't approach these things now, you can get them down the road this summer if you want to dig into those things. I mean, I think the biggest takeaway for a lot of this stuff, once we get into all these different styles, it's really the same as the things that we've learned before. If you really want to know, you read the plays. You really want to dig into the plays. You can read biographies and the writers and all these other things. But if you really want to know what they were talking about and what they were all about, read the plays, because all of the techniques that were created to do the work that they were doing were to serve the plays that were being written during those time periods. So, for example, the first chunk of books that I want to talk about are Stanislavski. Now, a couple things about Stanislavski. When his first books were translated into the English, the translations now are considered, I guess maybe most politely, they're considered incomplete, or straight up inconsistent or factually untrue. More of an adaptation than a translation of what Stanislavski really intended. So if you're ever Googling or you're in the library, or even if you've read, there were 3 initial books that were called An Actor Prepares, I believe An Actor Prepares, Creating a Character, and Becoming a Role. There are 3 of them, by Elizabeth Hapgood Reynolds. I would recommend you stay away from those books. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide you with some resources now where if you want to do a deeper dive, you can be a little bit more informed about what you're going for. So if we want to go to source materials first, I will just warn you, these are the 2 books. So An Actor's Work and An Actor's Work on a Role. Okay, so basically these 2 books are those initial 3 books combined, retranslated by a guy named John Benedetti. And these are, if you want to go primary source material, these are great. I will tell you, they are very dry. So if you're going to geek out and nerd out on Stanislavski, those are the books to start with. Also, at the end of those books, they have a lot of exercises and initial things that they would do that I find very helpful, and I have found very helpful both in teaching but also in directing. So those are 2 books that I would highly, highly recommend. Even if you start reading them and you're like, man, this is boring or this is whatever, those are the source materials. So I always like to start there and then depart kind of at your peril, because even if it's dry, if you can get through it, then you know you got it from the horse's mouth. And I think it's very important to do that initially, because anything else is really, it's kind of like a translation of a play. Very hard in a different culture, in a different idiom, to translate it one-to-one. There's always a little bit of adaptation and that kind of a thing. But these next 3 books are a lot more accessible And again, all these books are very easily found online. So the next one is My Life in Art by Stanislavski, and this is really an autobiography. So you're really getting into the less technical stuff and more about the life of an amazing artist at an incredible time in history. And you're learning about everything before, 19th century Russia into the founding of the Moscow Art Theater, his arguments with Chekhov, his arguments with Nemirovich Danchenko. And I also think, just to point out, from the reading, oftentimes we hear Stanislavski or we hear these names and they're lionized icons of theater, right? And we forget that they're human. You read about these stories of Chekhov, and he was so anxious. He was in Yalta at the premiere of The Seagull in Moscow, or the fact that he didn't think Stanislavski was directing his plays properly. He didn't, Stanislavski was approaching them as tragedies and dramas. Chekhov thought they needed more of the humor. So I think it's very important to, the fact that the living theater text humanizes him and those people. And it's important that we do that, because otherwise we tend to look through them as perfect icons rather than human beings who are flawed, right? So again, this My Life in Art is I think a great read, and also much more accessible. Less on the technique, more on the man and the time period. The next chunk right here, this book is my favorite book on Stanislavski ever. I think it's back in print. As you can see, this was I bought it used 15 years ago, and it was not, it was out of print. But this guy named Vasily Toporkov, who was an actor in the last company that Stanislavski was working on, a production of Tartuffe. And basically what this documents, it's really the only thing that documents his final years of working, and really his final phase of work, which was called the method of physical actions, which is completely different than emotional recall or emotion memory, right? Or sense memory, right? Sometimes those things are called. So a lot of times when Stanislavski is taught, especially because of things like, method acting, and particularly we'll learn a little bit later with Lee Strasberg, much more focus was paid to the emotions in terms of technique. And what Stanislavski moved towards the end of his career was a system that he called the method of physical actions, which was all about rooting your technique in actions that are repeatable, that would manifest emotions rather than the other way around. So not forcing yourself to feel something, but executing an action and then finding what actions could trigger certain emotions. It's oversimplified, but that gives you a sense. So if you ever hear, or if you've never heard the term method of physical actions, that's what he was working on before he died. He wasn't focused on emotion memory, sense recall, any of those things. He had moved beyond that, out of not just an aesthetic choice, but a practical thing. You can't control your emotions. That's not a foundation for a technique. And the more they learned, especially during that time period with psychology expanding and those things, is that, especially in the sense of actor training, it's not repeatable, and you don't will yourself to feel things. You can only focus on what you do. And funny enough, acting, right, the definition of acting is to do. So when you look at, one of the common phrases Stanislavski would say is, a repeatable line of actions, right? Or a logical sequence of repeatable actions, sometimes it's called, right? Well, if you think about it, those are the only things you have control over, right? Even if you have a great technique, 8 shows a week, are you going to really feel the exact same things every time? No. But in terms of what you're executing on stage objectively, the actions are what are going to be there. And so all of that, the rehearsals and kind of the working process during the end of his life with his final phase is outlined in this book, Stanislavski in Rehearsal, The Final Years. So highly, highly recommend this. This is, again, my favorite book on Stanislavski, period, is this one. Okay, so now the Cliff Notes version. If you're like, I want to know more about Stanislavski, maybe I'll go to those big books, but right now I just need some of the main basic ideas, summarizing most of the stuff. This is not a perfect book. I have some issues with it, but this, as you can see, very, very doable, very, very accessible. It's called the Stanislavski system. It's relatively new, or a new printing. I think it's been out for a couple printings, but it's by Sonia Moore, and it really goes through, the basic elements of the training system, things like the magic if, given circumstances, imagination, concentration, truth and belief, super objective, through lines, all of that stuff. I believe Sonia Moore, the author, was an actress in his company, if I'm not mistaken. But again, this is not by no means a thorough deep dive. And also I have some issues because it leans more into the early career Stanislavski and not into the later career stuff, which is much more relevant to what you're doing. But if you don't do anything and you only read this one, you'll be better than when you started. So again, those are kind of going from primary sources to Cliff Notes versions of the Stanislavski system. Those are some great resources for you. The next thing I wanted to bring up, again, are just some books that I found useful over the years, but also, being Captain Obvious here, it's very important that if you find yourself curious, or even if it's in your best interest to do some research, if you get hired to do a show or whatever it is that you need in terms of knowledge about a certain time period, or a play, or a playwright, whether it's in grad school, in the professional world, or beyond, seek out these resources because they are there, right? And the good old-fashioned library, or even used bookstores online where you can search for these things, just put in the Google thing, right? Expressionistic plays, or Appia, or Edward Gordon Craig, or Meyerhold, or whatever it is. And that's what I did when I was your age. I would just go in these things and go crazy and find these books and start reading them. So you get these little paragraphs in the Living Theater book, which are great. But if you want to dive into some of these other figures, I wanted to throw out a couple more books that I have that are really, really great resources. So one of them is called Michael Chekhov to the Actor on the Technique of Acting. And again, he was Anton Chekhov's nephew, and he ended up in the States and was a very, very famous acting teacher, particularly with film acting during the early and mid 20th century, lived in Los Angeles. His primary thing, if you want to just associate him with the technique, was called psychological gesture, and that's all outlined in here. And there's exercises and a whole slew of things related to technique in this book. It's fabulous. To the Actor on the Technique of Acting is that. And then Meyerhold, he is probably the most, he is like, he's complex, he's complicated, and you can't obviously contain what he was or encapsulate what he was in the chapters in Living Theater. But if what he was doing is intriguing to you, and even the biomechanics link that you're going to watch this week is intriguing to you, then I would highly recommend looking at these two books. One of them is called Meyerhold on Theater, and again, these are both in print by Edward Braun. And the next one is called Meyerhold at Work, and both of these really go in depth on both Meyerhold the man, the cultural milieu in Russia at the time, but also the technique and the philosophy behind the technique and what Meyerhold was trying to do. So again, those are the main resources. I wanted to just touch on a couple things, this being the first week. There are going to be some kinks, some mistakes perhaps in the syllabus. So some of you emailed me and said that the deadline for the quiz, for example, was 11 a.m. instead of 11:59 p.m., which is what I had promised on the syllabus. I've changed that, so I just want to make sure you all are aware of that. I'm trying to think of a couple other things. I just want to make sure that everyone understands, and any questions about the new revised syllabi, feel free to shoot me an email. I did want to say one other thing, too, about the discussions in the initial syllabus, and I will revise this. I asked for responses and a series of other things with the discussions. I'm going to simplify that. I just want each of you to respond to the discussion at least once. You can feel free to reply after that, but it'll be 5 points for the response. And the only thing I'm going to ask in terms of length, because some of you are writing quite a bit, and some of you have emailed me questions about how long do you want those things to be, is as long as you're making a point. I'm not going to say certain number of words or a certain length, but I think maybe a short paragraph, or just as long as you're making a point and backing it up. Be able to defend, think about it in class. Would you just spout out an opinion without, defending it with something? Or, have something to back it up, have some evidence, or anything that might support your point of view. But don't feel like you have to write a novel, but also don't just say yes or no, right? Or just answer the question simply. I just went over 10 minutes by a couple minutes, but this is the first one, so hopefully the next ones won't be as long, but it's still only about 14 or 15. So again, I'm hoping you guys are doing well. I'm in the mix, transitioning, homeschooling my kids, and also staying on top of this stuff. So, as I said in the syllabus and in the emails, I want to be a support network for you all. And anything that comes up that's you either have a question about or a concern about, and that could be content, that could be a deadline. This is a stressful and anxious time for everybody, and I'm completely understanding of the situation we're in. So I want to be able to work with you, and I certainly don't want theater history to be the source of agonizing or extended stress for any of you all. So I just want you to know I'm thinking about you and wishing you all well. And I will see you all on Canvas. Have a great week.